Let's go ahead and get started and see if we can get you home earlier. So we have an agenda. In front of us, and are there any revisions anybody would like to make to the agenda? We'd like to get to the end if we can today. Any announcements or anything?
Lisa.
Is there somebody on the phone?
Yeah, Lisa Seaman Crawford is on the line.
Okay, and we have her name up there.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Lisa. All right, so we have made a couple of minor revisions of the matrix, and Alex will kind of walk us through those really quickly, and then Cassandra will walk us through the few revisions that we've made on the report. We'll just pick up questions and study them as we go forward. Alex, would you mind starting?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our final meeting. We have in the matrix made just a couple of very small changes here. One is on the second page, section 13C, total cost of ownership discussion. There was a request to be a bit more explicit right in the text in the work group here about the incentive concept here for increasing state participation and using state funding to incentivize reducing the total cost of ownership. That is included, including a link. Any questions on that one? All right. Go ahead.
My dear friend and colleague, Senator Roosevelt, is not here. Can I just suggest maybe is there another way that we can call the RosaPep incentive is there will this be the final draft?
No. Well, this will be the draft that's attached to the report.
Okay.
Yes. So it's just informational, but we could change the name.
I'm just thinking if maybe we had a broader
term.
Yeah, just for.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we just strike RosaPep and say incentives as presented at the April 10th Ed Spec Workgroup meeting?
That works for me.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, that is it. Otherwise, as presented and ready to be attached to the report.
All right. Cassandra, please.
Okay, we have a few more revisions in the draft report on pages 2, 3, and 4. You're just going to see some minor grammatical stuff. On page 2, we put in the AKA for the 21st Century School Facilities Commission. Obviously, we more frequently talk about the not commission. On page 3, it's just some minor grammatical changes. And on 4 in the first paragraph, it's just some rewording. The only substantive change to the report is on page 6, where we added a new prominent discussion theme per your conversation at the last meeting that we have titled Sustainability of the Statewide School Facilities Portfolio, to make it clear that the work group is talking about not just sustainability of a single school facility, which is important, but also of the portfolio as a whole. And have clarified that total cost of ownership is in fact reduced total cost of ownership. Subsequent changes on 7, it's just grammatical statute instead of statute. And on page 8, this again was a clarification based upon your conversation at the last meeting to review the State Board of Education COMAR for implied space requirements, but not stopping there, to further recommend that the State Board of Education adopt COMAR language stating that the educational content standards shall not imply or specify the provision or use of a school facility space, that the use of that space is entirely a local decision. Again, based upon your conversation, if you go down to number 2 under recommendations to clarify that multiple use of space is a local decision, we added not just sharing best practices and models to the LEAs, but also to other stakeholders. On page 9, this was a change that you all had made to the matrix last time on number 2. Consider launching a joint state-local effort to develop a system for maximizing use of school facilities between jurisdictions where there is an agreed-upon joint programmatic opportunity. And under number 2, under recommendations for more accurate supply-demand analysis, to clarify that we also want to look at the impact of academic program characteristics when we're looking at demand. On page 10, we clarified that we're looking for alternative solutions rather than simply administrative ones, and added that the legislature should determine a process and agency to address issues and opportunities to increase utilization of underutilized space within the statewide school facilities portfolio. This is where we had started at the last meeting talking about even vacant properties that aren't being used as schools right now. Just a language clarification underneath to the single cost per square foot measure does not reflect the variability in school construction cost across the state. Just some clarifying language. And on page 11, we added one statement that the IAC should promote innovative solutions to facilities needs outside of the existing processes when the LEA can demonstrate fiscally advantageous solutions. This was talking about perhaps buying buildings or anything else that the LEA could propose that might fall outside of our existing processes. The green that you see there on page 11 was simply moved from shared use of space on page 13 to a more appropriate location within the report. There are no changes on page 12, and on page 13, per your recommendation at the last meeting, we have only adopted 2 of the 4 recommendations, and those we have left a little more general, that the NOT Commission or the state consider looking at a percentage of funding required for maintenance. This was based upon the discussion matrix as we revised it at the last meeting. Those are all of the changes that I have, but I do believe that some of the members might have a couple that we discussed before the meeting, specifically on page 12.
There we go. So on page 12, first paragraph, third line down, it says limit decision-making information. I thought after the word information, it might be advantageous to add with respect to design and construction. So the sentence would read, limit decision-making information with respect to design and construction to first project cost severely limits, et cetera. And then at the bottom of the page, directly under the bolded maintenance and operations activities line, where it says, while capital dollars are accounted for and often derived from separate sources, I thought eliminate separate and insert other between sources and than. So they're just sort of grammatical preferences.
Any objection? Okay. Senator.
This is more of a practical kind of moving forward. I strongly agree with the language. When it gets reported out, just sort of as you envision this, so when the IAC's allocations come out each year, which will always come with a total project cost right there, will there be sort of a standard process now for you'll also be reporting the total cost of ownership alongside of the cost in the capital budget?
Whenever the ed specs come is the first step, where we will be laying out what the project as it's being conceived is compared to the baseline cost. That'll be the first thing that we'll look at, and we'll keep track of that for every project in which we're involved. As we get to the end of the design, where the IEC allocate only a portion of the projects at this point. That could change, where we're actually allocating the whole project if some of these incentives take place. everything we will report that we have information for. If it is less than the baseline, yes, absolutely, we have to report that, because that was something that if an incentive comes about, we'll have to report out what the incentive was, how much it was. If it's above, if the LEA uses their own funds to go above, that's harder for us to do, but we make every effort to do that now, to capture all the information so that our facility database is correct.
Okay, but in like the annual report to the legislature that comes out with the
Yes.
listing of all the projects, it has the dollar amount per project.
Yes.
Given the sort of cultural shift that this will, is there any expectation that you'll also report on, or that there would be a column of total cost of ownership alongside of the total cost of construction?
I think that we can do that as far as estimated total cost of ownership.
Right.
Within your report and within the matrix, one of the recommendations that carries forward is to change the way that we account for our total cost of ownership, and to adopt the definitions by the National Council of School Facilities so that we really do understand what it costs to own facilities, which is hard to get at right now. So I think through actual reporting, we're going to be able to get closer to what it really costs. We can look at the estimates, but then to understand what it really costs is going to be more valuable.
Thank you.
Yes. That's something that you'll have to pick up at the legislative side, probably.
That's what I'm trying to think of where we can grab it in.
Thank you.
Bob, I've got a question that came up yesterday, and I was trying to figure out the right place to bring this up, but on page 11, under the state not actively incentivizing cost savings in school construction, and you used this example in your presentation at ASBO about, let's say a school decides not to build a gym.
Yes.
And there's, it's in Baltimore City, and right next door, there's a Rec and Parks that has a gym that's underutilized during the day, and they choose to use that in lieu of building a gym, which is what we're promoting. I don't want to see an LEA lose funding because they're not building that square footage. So in this recommendation, are we covering enough incentive for them to do something like that? Would it be part of the IAC appeal process? Because I guess I always go back to like the workaround as the facility planner. I'm going to try to maximize my state dollars. So if I can max them out by, why wouldn't I just build my own gym? And then I can have it anytime I want because I can get the state dollars to build it. So is there going to be some sort of, where it's not the example where maybe they're purchasing a building and rehabbing it, where there's a direct cost, but we're still incentivizing savings?
So the current draft of the report has a recommendation for an incentive that can come at a later point. The incentive later on, if the LEA were to choose to provide and support the required educational programs, Department of Education determines what is required of every LEA to graduate in the state, and physical education is part of that. If the LEA can find another way to support those educational programs, your example was a gym next door that they can use, and the incentive, which isn't here right now, you could make money for your LEA both initially for the first cost as well as the long-term cost, if that came about. That's one of your recommendations that we will carry to the funding work group. The current recommendations in the report are only to make clear that that's your choice, that there's nothing implied in the requirements for educational program that says how that you go about doing that. So it would be your choice. If your decision today was that you're going to build the gym even though you had an alternative, because you would rather have the money and get the gym built, there's nothing that would encourage you or prohibit you from doing that.
Okay.
I think that's why the incentive is important.
Yeah, I think that answers it. The incentive is if you can demonstrate that you're, thinking long range as total cost of ownership, reducing it by not building the gym, and you get a little bonus for doing that, then I think that addresses my concern.
This simply unplugged the restriction where there were implied requirements to build a gym. And, frankly, straight up, the IAC has adopted the sufficiency standards, which are intended to be minimum. It includes a gym, because that's how we all have been delivering the facilities to support educational programs to this point. So that's intended to capture deviations from minimum educational sufficiency so that we can find the outliers, those that aren't able to deliver education as it is now. This work is taking the stops out to allow the encouragement to approach it differently. You would not be restricted by the sufficiency standards as we measure things from not building it. But we certainly need to keep track of that, that this was a decision you made when you built the school so that 20 years later it didn't become a deficiency because of an earlier decision.
How would that get captured?
How would we capture that?
Just in the decision?
Yes. Yes, at the decision for the IEC. If there was a decision to build the school, and the school have plans that are approved, let's say they get an incentive for not doing that, all of that information will be included in our facilities database.
There would still be, or could be, some long-term cost involved, because I couldn't imagine that the facility wouldn't want them to share some of the upkeep and all that if they're using the facility, correct?
There absolutely could. If you, let's say the facility was owned by the county, it wasn't owned by the LEA. If there was a cost to renting that, as you're looking at your total cost of ownership, that's something that you would want to look at. That's not something the state would participate in, except we already do as far as operational costs, but you're watering down those dollars that you're using for everything else, education, maintenance, and so forth. So it's just part of the equation, part of the consideration.
Well, and that's where my concern came from. So the state's not going to participate in, like Kathleen said. So it sort of disincentivizes us to do exactly what we're saying we wanted to do. Do you understand? Like, if I build my own gym, the state will help pay for it. If I go use someone else's gym, they're not going to pay for any of it. But if I can get that incentive, then I think it maybe will offset it.
That's what you would have to calculate. And I think everything that you have done has really bounded future work. I was talking to the senators after the meeting. In my opinion, this kind of review of the process is something that should occur annually, that there ought to be a committee that gathers what's working, what's not working, and make revisions. And if, in fact, we all save money by allowing a facility not to be built and the state then participates in additional base funding formula in order to help pay the rent of an existing facility that is already there, maybe that's something to consider in the future, but it's not something that we currently have discussed. Could be a private facility, so that.
Dollars go towards a lease?
Pardon me?
Can capital dollars go towards a lease?
Currently, no. Capital dollars can only go towards improvements that are owned by the state or the LEA or the county.
This, and we went over this.
We're all done?
Yeah, we're all done. You can go home.
We received, welcome, Senator.
Thank you. We're sorry to be late.
It's all right.
There's a little traffic jam out there.
I
as you may know.
understand. Yeah, I understand.
Figured we'd get
Representative,
home before
welcome.
the baseball game, so we were
Sorry about that.
last cold beer.
We'll try to get you out so you can go over and watch the game.
There's graduation too. After this graduation.
So we went through the revisions. There were only minor revisions in the matrix, and then also in the report. In fact, Cassandra, since we have new folks, could you review the revisions that were made by the committee that everybody agreed, just to make sure there's no.
I would appreciate that. I'm sorry.
So there were only minor revisions in the discussion matrix on page 2. The group decided to strike Rosa Pep right there under number 1, under the recommendations. So instead of referring to these as the Rosa Pep incentives, we're just referring to them as incentives that will decrease the total cost of ownership.
Just let me take a look at it. Incentives increase.
And then there were additional changes in the report on page 12. In the third line of the first paragraph, it reads, exceed the initial cost of construction, limiting decision-making information. We're gonna insert with respect to design and construction.
I'm sorry, I'm not following you. Page 12,
Yes, page 12, the third line of the first paragraph.
first cost of constructing?
Sorry, exceed the fourth line including the header.
Exceed the initial cost.
Yes, so limiting decision-making information, we're going to insert with respect to design and construction. To first project costs can severely limits the ability of decision makers to make good decisions. So we're just clarifying what decisions they're making. And then under the bolded section, maintenance and operations dollars are underfunded and funding competes with operational dollars.
I'm sorry, where are you?
Further down on the page, there's a bolded section that reads maintenance and operations activities. The first unbolded line under that.
While capital dollars?
Yes, while capital dollars are accounted for, we're gonna revise the sentence to read, while capital dollars are accounted for and often derived from sources other than operational dollars. So we're striking separate
Yeah, I get
and
you.
added other.
That was it.
That's it.
But the stuff in red, I thought was added since the last meeting.
It was added since the last meeting. This is what was included in the mail that went out to you all on Thursday. I can recap that if
Why
you'd
don't we?
like. So on pages,
Which document are we looking at?
the report.
The report.
2, 3, 4, and 5, those are all just very minor grammatical changes. On page 6 is the primary substantive change that you're gonna find, where we added a prominent discussion theme of sustainability of the statewide school facilities portfolio to emphasize that it's not just sustainability of a single school, but of the entire portfolio that matters, and clarifying under the second theme that it's not just total cost of ownership, but is in fact reduced total cost of ownership.
I actually had a question on the first one. I'm glad we put in reduced total cost of ownership. I didn't really understand what it meant, that whole paragraph. I mean, to me, it's sort of implied that there was some statewide, it sort of implied we should do some things for the statewide portfolio benefit, even at the expense of a local school, which I don't think was the intent.
Looking at the original agreed intent, we were looking at the portfolio, and so that we could, let's look at that on page 5, where the strategic goal was a statewide portfolio of school facilities that are educationally effective and fiscally sustainable. So as we went through discussions, we tried to keep that focus very clear. A third theme that was introduced and then carried through to those other two was local control and local autonomy to make decisions related to educationally effective and fiscally sustainable. So it really became a three-legged stool, all of the discussions throughout.
Right, but when you say while the decisions on specific right is critical, the individual must be to the benefit of the school's facilities portfolio. I mean, that sounds like my school is supposed to help the schools every place else in the state. Maybe it's just a wording issue, but it sort of it sounds like lack of local control.
Well, every project matters. So it's to keep an eye on everything that makes a difference. It won't be projects that are not projects. The facility's already built, it exists. There's no changing what we have already. But as a project comes up for consideration where it begins to be considered by all of the things that we've discussed in this work group, then any improvement to that one school makes a slight improvement or large, depending on the school, to the statewide portfolio, which is about 1,400 schools.
Well, the way you say that sounds much more minimal. The way it's written here says that the individual choice must be to the benefit of the portfolio. I mean, that seems much more, mean, the point, if nobody else is
Okay.
confused, I'm
This is
fine
new
with it.
language.
I don't understand what it means.
Mhm.
I mean, how do you benefit the portfolio?
By
Well, it's-
doing things like consolidating underutilized schools or finding, as you all had discussed, better solutions like buying a building that already exists and
Okay, well,
renovating it.
that's not clear from that language, then. If that's what's meant, that didn't say that to me at all.
The intent is that every move that we have the opportunity to make is to increase the fiscal sustainability of the portfolio.
But that sounds like every act of kindness that any individual makes it a better world. Okay, that's probably right, but I'm not sure how that leads you to making actual decisions. I'll leave it there, I'll leave it there. I mean,
Okay.
I don't think it means anything.
Okay.
I'm sorry to slow you down.
Keep going, Cassandra, please.
So if we move on to page 8, that's the next substantive change that you're going to see. It's based upon your discussion at the last meeting. Review State Board of Education COMAR for implied space requirements and recommend that the State Board of Education adopt COMAR language stating that educational content standards shall not imply or specify the provision or use of school facility space. The use of space is a local decision. So that's just stronger language that we had before.
Yeah,
Um,
that's great.
Under number 2, we're just clarifying that we will share information on multi-use best practices, not just to LEAs, but also to other stakeholders. If you turn to page 9, under number 2, again, this is language that you all agreed upon at your last meeting about maximizing the use of school facilities between jurisdictions where there's an agreed upon joint programmatic opportunity.
Great.
And on number 2, under the demand side, to discuss the incorporation of academic program characteristics when we're talking about demand for school facilities.
Is this the place where we were addressing the choice school issue? Is that what that means?
This is where we were talking about the demand for a school facility being based not just upon cohort and population, but also upon specific academic attributes, certain programs that exist in a
But
facility.
is this the language, we had a long conversation, is this the language that's intended to say this supply-demand analysis should not be limited to demographics and should
Yes.
not be driven by the assumption that every school, or even most schools, are catchment area neighborhood schools? Is that what this means?
Yes, that's the language that came out of that discussion last time, yes.
And I think it could be clearer. I mean, I think we may understand what it means, but I'm not sure other people reading this will understand what it means. And I really think we ought to
You
expand that.
propose change?
I mean, maybe just be specific about it. So, for example, or this means we're not going to get hung up on pure demographics in this analysis. It means that we understand people are going to look at the variety of ways the school system decides to allow kids to decide what school to go to. If that's what that means, I really think when we're all dead, nobody's going to understand what that means.
So that's why the word demand got in there. So we were looking for elements that affected demand, and we.
No, and that's what we got with the program characteristics. No, I remember that whole discussion. I'm just saying, rereading it a week and a half later, if everybody else thinks it's perfectly clear, when the issue comes up in a fight over a specific school, I'm going to come back to all you guys and say, well, this group voted unanimously that it means what I say it means.
In number 1, in that section, it needs an ED, current and projected demand.
Yes.
Got it?
I mean, that, number 1 deals with neighborhood, and number 2, if it doesn't deal with neighborhood, I mean, I think you got to add to number 2 something about non-neighborhood schools to make it clear that if that is what we mean, right?
Do we want to add on to the end of that sentence?
Without regard to,
To neighborhood.
yeah, something like that, yeah. Thank you.
Any objections to that revision? Okay. Keep going, Cassandra.
So the next substantive change is on page 10, where we note that the legislature should determine a process and agency to address issues and opportunities to increase utilization of underutilized spaces within the statewide school facilities portfolio.
Again, for clarification purposes, I think that long discussion was for both school and non-school purposes.
It was.
Probably ought to say that. Because that was confusing to us when we were talking about it all in the room together.
So suggested language?
Unutilized, should determine a process to address issues and opportunities to increase utilization, unutilized state within the space for both school, just add on, for both school and non-school purposes.
Okay,
If that
yes.
is okay with other people.
And then moving on, just some reworking of language on that second half of page 10. And then on page
Before we
11.
leave, was there any objection to that revision? Okay, thank you.
Then on page 11, we've added a statement. The work group also discussed that the IAC should promote innovative solutions to facilities needs outside of existing processes when the LEA can demonstrate fiscally advantageous solutions.
Again, what do we think that means? What were we actually talking about?
I think,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
Here we were talking about a unique idea that an LEA might have, not just potentially, we talked about them buying a building and renovating it, but that the IAC should emphasize whatever unique solution might be proposed, not just those that we can think of ahead of time. So it was meant to provide more general language to direct the IAC in some of their policy decisions.
So it was intended to remove any limitations on how that the LEA might think it wants to support the educational programs, again, that are defined by the Board of Education, the State Board of Education, but how that those programs are supported and delivered becomes a local solution. The building is a local solution, which is what the IEC is concerned with.
What does outside existing processes mean? What does the definition mean? What is the existing
Well, we currently have
process mean?
COMARs where we say that we are looking at square foot per student. We are looking at dollars per square foot. Let's say hypothetically that an LEA determines that they can use some type of technology,
Yeah.
right? That is not worked into that dollar per square foot price as we're looking at buildings.
Okay,
But
maybe, do you mean models rather than processes then? Is that what you really mean?
I would think we would mean more rules and regulations, the things that
Oh.
currently box the IAC into, that the IAC should be considering opening those up.
Well, I didn't get that out of this at all. Then I think we should say that.
We strike processes and replace it with
That-
rules and
if that's what we
IAC
mean.
rules and regulations.
how
How
about
about
processes?
parameters?
I'm sorry.
How about parameters, existing parameters, because that's really what they are.
It's kind of like your nurse's station.
Absolutely.
I think.
And it's also like the gym.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But again, I think more clarity would help for people who are not involved in these conversations.
It's always good to have fresh eyes on things, so, this
Well, I got
is
old
good.
eyes, so I'm not bringing fresh eyes.
Old fresh eyes.
I got trifocals.
And is it existing recommended parameters, or,
Yeah, that's the other issue.
because it's not, they're not required parameters, they're just guidelines.
As it relates to the IAC versus MSDE's programmatic guidelines, the IAC regulations about what we will and won't participate in are regulations that we're required to follow.
I'm sorry, whose regulations you're required to follow?
The IAC's regulations.
Your own regulations.
So these are changes that the IAC could make to open up their regulations and provide some more flexibility.
And the language is intended to allow this thought and this process to continue, that we don't know how to solve all of our problems now, but we want to unstick it so that we're not just doing what we've always done.
How about outside the existing regulatory framework?
Okay?
That's even, yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's
More specific. I like that. Thank you.
Okay, the green text on that page is just a move from page 13 with minor clarification to state not just explore allowing, but that the IAC should allow the purchase of buildings for renovation as a part of a project's cost.
Great.
And then on page 13, we have simply changed the text to mimic the changes that you all made to the discussion matrix at the last meeting, striking the recommendations that you did not adopt, and adding some language under number 4 and number 5, recommending that the Kerwin Commission include a funding bonus or reward for meeting a certain level of maintenance effectiveness, and consider incentives in which the state share of systemic projects would be increased where the system to be replaced has exceeded the lifespan expected.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for going back over it. I appreciate it.
That's it.
I only have one other change. On the members and affiliations, I want to be called Jim, not James. Thank you.
Technical one on page 6 of the matrix. The blue box, the numbering, it goes 1-1, so 1-2, and then it's ed space. I think that one's ed space, not ed spec total cost. Spec? Okay.
Yeah.
Page 5 needs to be renumbered in the matrix.
Is that it on technical corrections, Senator?
Okay.
I've got one or two questions before we do, then I'm going to second the motion.
All right. Move favorable and discussion can continue.
That's right. I just want to get clarity, because we have responsible actor out in the big pages. And it's not clear to me how that fits into the report. So I'm trying to understand who we are saying should do what with this. I'm a little confused, actually, because the report doesn't, it's consistent with this, but it doesn't match this. So conceptually, who do we think we're making which recommendations to? And how will they know?
To everyone, and the discussion matrix is going to be attached in its entirety as an appendix to the report. So it's meant to be considered in tandem.
Okay, but am I right that generally who the recommendation is to is not really systematically laid out in the report?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me make a suggestion. I think it would be helpful if you all, and I don't think we have to delay doing the report, would take both documents and take all the recommendations and organize them by who they are to, so there'd be a second appendix that would be, here are the recommendations of the IAC. Here are the recommendations of the funding work group. Here are the recommendations of the legislature. Here are the recommendations of the King of France. So the King of France can look at it and say, oh, that's the one I'm supposed to pay attention to, because otherwise I think it'll be like a needle in a haystack.
Discussion on that. Let me describe our intent, and that's why we added the colors and the shades, because there are a lot of options here. Some clearly are within the IAC to be able to work on, or the Board of Education, or MSDE, and we've labeled those under the specific issues. Some of them, such as those in yellow shading, are outside the direct statutory charges, and there's something that the legislature would want to pick up, and it's clear. But as you read the report, what we've tried to do is synthesize
I understand.
everything that you have done into something that has a logical basis that
think it's
the
great.
legislature or anybody else could pick up and understand what it was you were trying to say. So we went from the specifics, and that's why we used this matrix as we did, to try to line through these tasks that it's hard for anybody to understand, and we struck some out and we added some to get to something that had a theme that was easy to follow.
Which I agree with.
Okay.
I think I said last time, I think the report is basically great. Maybe I'm just speaking for legislators who are even busier and less informed than the three of us are. I'd like them to be able to look at the thing and go to the back, to the index and say, okay, what am I supposed to worry about? I just think it would really help educate people about the work we did. That's all. Is there a downside to it?
Well, the downside is I'm trying only I haven't figured it out yet. Exactly.
Well, you just
how to
take the
do that.
responsible actor column, and you say, what's IAC? And you say, following recommendation of the IAC. And then you put State Board of Education, which are the recommendations of the State Board of Education.
Could we add an additional document then?
Yeah,
so
that's
that
what
we
I'm- that's
have
what I
two
meant.
appendix.
Yeah.
So that this would be as it is, this would be as it is, and then we add a third document that would break those out as that works. Okay,
Yeah.
I can visualize that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Second,
Any objection to that? No objection, so you will add that onto the motion, Senator?
So amended.
Thank you.
So actually, as I'm asking now, charter schools would be the same rules as charter schools if they are getting a building approved, or I don't think there are very many building new buildings, but
The charter schools that are within public school facilities, yes,
Would apply.
absolutely the same. If they are independent,
Mm-hmm.
they're operated outside of a public school facility, none of this directly applies, but the concepts all apply.
they would.
And you could pick them up if you were to design legislation that would support charter schools. You could pick up from the themes that you have described. To
Oh, right,
carry
they're not in the
forward.
CIP. So this is all bounded by state funding?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
well, actually, let me ask a question on that one, because I don't really understand the way the charter school rules apply to school construction in existing public school buildings. We don't have any in Prince George's or Anne Arundel, but they do in Baltimore City. So is the way it works now that if the charter school is in or wants to be in a building that is a public school building as defined by law, whatever the hell that is, then state school construction money can be used?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes through the same process as any other capital project. We have to prioritize it with all of the other projects, but yes, since it's in a district building, it gets prioritized and put into the CIP just like anything else. If it is not in our building, it does not.
Okay, but I'm not arguing the merits or the politics of this, but just so I understand. And maybe this has happened in Baltimore City, I just don't know. So it would seem as though a charter school, in cooperation with the district, could take an existing non-school district building and say, we want the school system to buy the building, and we want state school construction money to repair the building, and then the school system would lease it to the charter school the way they do any other building that they lease to a charter school? That's
So-
the way the system works?
I mean, we've never done that in the city because we don't have the money to buy the buildings, but, but I suppose, I mean,
And the structure doesn't support it currently. That's one of your recommendations.
What's structured on?
The current CIP structure. That's one of your recommendations.
Well, that's where I'm going with this.
Right.
That's where I'm going with this.
No, the point on page 11 that was added to the report, I think.
To be able to purchase.
Supports exactly that kinds of
Okay,
concept.
that's what I'm
That's the
trying
kind
to-
of
that's what I'm trying to
innovative,
clarify.
right.
So I'm just.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Senator Furch had already figured this out. but
Covered.
I'm trying to
Yes.
catch up here. So, I got it. Thank you. That clarifies it for me.
Senators. Okay, we have a, yes.
I'm sorry,
Huh?
page 13, I'm really wrestling with this one. On page 13, at the top of the page, the number 3. Request that the Curb Commission consider isolating the use of operational maintenance funding. I understand the implications, kind of like, you need to put money and set it aside for maintenance. I'm trying to think of all the different ways that LEAs will interpret that, but my second comment is much clearer, I think. Where we say implementing standard NCSF definitions, I think that might be confusing to LEAs because we structure our budgets according to the MSDE financial reporting manual, and I think you're going to find there's inconsistencies between the NCSF definitions and the MSDE financial
I
reporting.
think that's the problem we're addressing, isn't it?
Well, so if you tell me to follow the NCSF, I'm going to be in violation of the MSDE reporting manual.
Maybe we need a recommendation to MSD to fix it?
I think the MSDE financial reporting manual, maybe insert that in place of the, there's inconsistencies.
Yeah, no.
Down to who fixes furniture, or who buys light bulbs. I think it's going to drive the financial people nuts if we try to impose NCSF definitions on the budget.
So,
Big issue.
so on that point, Alex, would you like to expand?
Well, amongst the states at the national level, there has been discussion about of effectively a standardizing or a crosswalking of all these varied different definitions that are used by states, localities, and even the U.S. Department of Education. And so I think that convergence is the idea to address exactly that concern that you raised.
So there would be, I think what I hear Bob saying is you certainly don't want to have to report it two ways. That could be confusing. So the National Center for Educational Statistics are the ones that develop these cost code elements that are all used in the buildings and everything else.
Gotcha.
I mean, you can break down within the cost elements, as you know, the type of educational provision about 500 or 600 different ways. I mean, it is very detailed. But it's apparent when you look at facilities that same understanding of what was needed wasn't there when those elements were created. And so we end up not being able to fully understand what the total cost of ownership is to own and operate facilities, from the original purchase through the renewal.
Gotcha.
Operations, maintenance, and then finally renewal, to be able to keep track of what does it really cost to own and operate these facilities in particular areas. So these definitions are intended to get us there. The language that we discussed previously was to ask the Kerwin Commission to consider these, that there would be advantage to switching so that you wouldn't be reporting twice. You wouldn't be reporting to the National Center for Educational Statistics. I have done a crosswalk. This would not be hard to do your own reporting under the NCES, and then for the reporting that's required through MSDE and then nationally, which is much simpler. It doesn't have all the categories that are available, to be able to simply crosswalk that and report it the way that they've always received it at the national NCS level. So this is a recommendation. It's not a solution. I think that every LEA could start keeping their records individually per those cost codes. And we distributed those. I don't have them here in front of me, but we distributed those when we talked about them during this discussion.
Yeah, and I may be way down in the weeds. I think the only unfortunate thing is, again, for things like repairing furniture and light bulbs, that's lumped into my 10. The moment you use the NCSF, I've got to extract those costs, which may not be easily extracted, and put them over here in the NCSF. So it's going to drive the accountants nuts. I understand the overall objective would be to better define the facility operation maintenance costs, but it doesn't match with how we're required to structure the budget. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this came up because I pointed out that we're all reporting it differently,
Yes.
what's included. So I understand the objective, but I understand Bob's concern. I guess, again, it would maybe just require us to report it to the IAC a certain way. But I agree, it would be hard to break some of those things out.
And this may be too involved. I don't know if we could propose a change to the financial reporting manual that would do it so that we don't have to restructure the budget, but divide the budget up.
Yes, the Kerwin Commission could do that.
Okay.
And again, I think that we could do this in Maryland and not be tripped up to meet the required reporting at the federal level.
Okay.
That crosswalk has been developed, and it's available to be able to do that. We would be steps ahead. And we would be able to compare Frederick to Somerset, which right now, because of the lack of definition, and they're just not as specific as they need, we can't. Because everybody reads the current the current cost elements differently.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I think we need to resolve this issue like here today. I'm not on the Kerwin Commissions. These guys are. I mean, if we toss this as a Kerwin Commission, I think people's eyes are going to glaze over. They can say, call me back when you figure it out. And that worries me because I think we do want to try to get the Kerwin Commission and the legislature interested in having some set aside for maintenance. So I don't want them to say, we can't do it because the accountants can't agree among themselves and they're all definitionally challenged. So I think we need to say, how are we going to address his issue? Are we comfortable with what it says now, which is that the standard should be the NCSF definitions and suck it up, local school systems? Or are we going to say the mismatch is going to be figured out by the IAC and they're going to put out guidelines? Or what are we going to do?
Well, if you're asking my opinion, I think
I'm
that
asking your
we would
opinion.
want to direct the cost accounting that makes sense for our facilities to be carried out,
As defined by the IAC?
as defined by the National Council of School Facilities definitions.
Can you live with that? Or is that the problem you're raising?
If we wanted to incorporate it into the financial manual, which is what the accountants use, we could put in language stating that the Kerwin Commission consider not only using these, but requiring that MSDE implement it in the financial reporting.
And that's the thing you said is going to make people's heads explode, right?
Yeah, again, I'm trying to put this in non-confusing terms, but the moment you use the NCSF and they use terms like fixing movable equipment and furniture, my accountants are going to go nuts, because every LEA doesn't track how much they're spending on boilers, how much they're spending on desks. The
Okay,
moment you
but-
tell them you have to, they're going to,
But that goes to the substance of the issue. I mean, I saw this in Prince George's County. I mean, the way it was described to me in Prince George's County is the way we track it doesn't allow you to have the information you need to make good
That's
decisions.
That's correct. And the National Council of School Facilities does not track movable furniture. What it tracks is the original purchase of the property, the development of the site. These are acquisition charges. So it categorizes everything that you do when you're first acquiring or building or buying an old one into an acquisition, so that you know over time that this LEA is more successful in holding their acquisition costs down. And then the next step is in maintenance, and maintenance includes capital maintenance. It's not just fixing things. It's the replacement of the roofs and that, which are required.
What if we did this? What if we said the standard will be set by the IAC, and then you and your colleagues can go and fight with the IAC, figure it out, and the Kerwin Commission will be able to transcend the issue because they have so much confidence in the IAC.
So request that the
Does that work, Bill?
that the IAC
You got a better idea?
recommend to the it would be the state school board.
Okay.
Request that the IAC recommend.
I mean, I think fundamentally it's about, maintenance will be in the foundation dollar amount. So whatever we don't know what the foundation dollar amount will be. Call it 9,000 a student, 10,000 a student, somewhere in there. That builds in the maintenance cost per student. And so I think what you're asking potentially for is asking the Kerwin Commission to recommend a categorical funding line item
Yes.
around maintenance.
That's what we are recommending.
Right.
That's not this, Senator, that's not this particular point, which is on number 3. It's a matter of accounting for it, because the cost of owning and operating facilities is not just the foundation funding, it's also capital funding from the state, it is capital funding from the counties, and sometimes, occasionally, we have some outside capital funding that might come, even operational funding from the feds.
Okay, I'm sorry, this is the bonus provision. This is not the categorical funding provision. Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
yes. So,
But either way, you got to have a definition.
We do have two separate points in number 3, and I think that Senator Ferguson is right in pointing out that the first one is isolating the use of maintenance funding, and that also gets around to the amount, right, in the foundation funding, and then definitions and accounting, which help us account for and track and understand, right? That's really separate. So it may be that it makes sense to divide number 3 into 2 separate recommendations, because the responsible actor may be different for each, and that it could be recommend rather than request the Kerwin Commission, but recommend And then we could say, for the second one, the state board, et cetera. Does that make sense?
So I'm going to be persistent here one more time. When I look at the definitions, one says repair furniture is operations, the state says repair furniture is maintenance. That has to be rectified by accountants, and it's going to drive them nuts.
That has to what?
The definitions mention furniture repair.
Right.
One says it's operations, the other says it's maintenance. So when they come to tell me how much did you spend, I'm going to have to extract out what I spent on furniture, which is something I don't do now. And if I don't do it, I'm guessing.
That's a solvable
Don't do
problem.
it.
That's a very solvable problem.
And that's what I'm thinking, let Kerwin or whoever solve it with MSDE and fix the financial reporting manual, because I can't fix that. That's the
No,
whole
but,
point.
are you saying you don't want to split it out, or are you saying?
I don't know that we have the sophistication right now to say how much money I spent on fixing furniture as opposed to fixing walls or this or that. I mean, that's pretty sophisticated tracking system.
And for those who know more about this than I do, is that a material issue?
Only to accountants. When
No, it's not just to accountants. Is that a financially material issue to the school system?
I think, like Bob, I mean, we generalize a lot of our maintenance. So again, like if you buy a pallet of light bulbs, we don't have a sophisticated tracking system for how many bulbs go to each school. So it's not as granular, I think, as it needs to be.
Right.
And I think, for me, just looking at that spreadsheet we had last time, I want to simplify it and just say this is what's included in your maintenance and operations, and just say general maintenance, painting, but not. My example last time was the IT network technicians. Their salaries, to me, should not be part of. But again, now I've just talked myself out of it, because some of them might, like ours don't install data drops and things like that. We contract out for that, so that falls under my maintenance. Whereas some other counties might do that in-house with their network technicians, and so maybe they should fall under it. So it just, to me, it needs to be clearly defined county to county. I don't know what that system looks like, but maybe the IAC could define that.
I think that I'm understanding now, and Senator, you're right, and Alex, thank you for recognizing that. We have two things. We have, one is the pure facility cost of owning and maintaining a facility. And maintenance, the definition of maintenance for the National Council of School Facilities is everything that's required to ensure that the facility, as it was originally built, will continue to support the educational programs that it was originally built to support. So whether it's fixing roofs or modifying the technology so that, because the delivery has changed,
Or
modify
replacing
the
light
technology to make it work. All of that is,
Including replacing light bulbs?
yes,
Okay, all
absolutely.
right, that's fine, okay.
That can be routine maintenance.
Okay, that's
Or
fine.
it can be capital
Take yes
maintenance
for an
if you
answer,
have to
okay.
change the fixtures out.
Okay, right, okay.
So that's one thing. And then the other thing that this is saying, and I've got some language for the first one. On the second part of this, we are saying that we need to define what is in operational maintenance and define it very well so that it can be used to make recommendations to the Kerwin Commission about what allowable uses of the funding formula are for maintenance. I believe that's what I heard. And I'm trying to read between the lines, because sometimes if you have to contract for your services rather than have them in as your own personnel, it's the use of the funding source that is going to define how that you account for it. And really, we don't want to do that.
Right, that doesn't make sense.
Right. We want to, if something needs to be fixed, regardless of the funding
No, it's
source,
fixed,
we
yeah.
keep track of it in
Absolutely.
the same category.
Absolutely.
So we need to divide this into two parts. One is allowable uses of the funding for the formula, which is a Kerwin Commission. And then the other is, what does it cost to own and operate facility, whether it is, regardless of the funding source?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator.
I agree with all that.
Okay.
I still come back to the question of, the Kerwin Commission shouldn't have to figure this out.
Okay,
The IAC should have to figure this out.
okay.
Do people disagree with that?
I would have to defer to my members. As a director, I would say that we are closer to being able to make recommendations to the Board of Education, and maybe the Kerwin Commission doesn't have to deal with it. that if there's a lack of funding in the end, that would be a Kerwin Commission.
Yeah, I mean, the funding is a Kerwin issue, but the definition,
Yeah.
I'm just saying the
Yeah.
technical definition here
Okay.
seems way above the Kerwin Commission's pay grade.
So let me just revise number 3 as a place to start, so that we're just talking about capturing costs so that they're easily comparable regardless of the funding source. Request that the IC recommend to the State Board of Education
Kerwin Commission.
to implement the standard National Council school facility definitions to clearly define uses of facility funding.
And just to be clear, facility funding is operational dollars, not CIP dollars.
That should be clarified.
It would be both.
Because the problem comes in
Oh, I
if a
see.
district has it's essentially like what becomes an ineligible project for the CIP. So I don't have the specificity to sort of know, but like, let's use the network thing. If a school's, I don't know, I'm not going to have the expertise to be able to talk it
Well,
through.
what's the question you're trying to get at?
They don't, when would a school system be told by the IAC that is not a qualified project for the CIP? Because it isn't defined as
Okay.
it is an operational maintenance thing, not a NCSF.
So, I think I understand your question, and the purpose of number 3, one of the purposes, is regardless, let me just make an example. You own a car. You have to buy the car, you have to put fuel in the car, you have to change the tires in the car, and all of these things you have to do over time. And what you want to know is about what does it cost you per year if you own the car for 10 years, right? So what we want to do is, whether you paid for it out with cash, or whether you paid for it with a credit card, or somebody gave it to you.
You're really
as a
getting at, are
gift.
you changing your oil regularly, or are you buying a new engine?
We want to know all the
Both of
costs.
those, right.
Over time that go into that facility, and of course, our whole facility portfolio, so that we can learn over time what's best. Maybe, as Senator Rosepep has suggested, maybe shorter life facilities actually are less expensive over time, if you just replace them and keep going, or maybe it's building it more expensively in the beginning and has lower cost of ownership, cost to own and operate it. So what we want to know is, and these are great questions, is what does it cost? So let me try this. Request that the IEC recommend the State Board of Education, implement standard National Council school facilities definitions to clearly define facility ownership expenses. So we just leave it as a very broad
You
statement.
cool with that, Bob?
I still have a concern about, like, my network technician example. So in this number, are salaries included for employees, like
Yes.
staff, maintenance staff? So if I have network technicians that are doing repairs to infrastructure, like data drops, telephone, lines and things like that, but they're also the ones that are programming laptops for students and things like that, how do you identify their time, their salary, building maintenance versus, I have technicians that are just out, literally setting up email addresses for all of our staff.
Senator?
I've got a simple suggestion. The IAC will give you guidelines as to how to do that. I mean, it's a classic cost accounting issue. If the cost is less than half of 1% of your budget, don't worry about it. That's one rule. If it is 2% of your budget and you think some of it's here and some of it's there, you choose whether it's 60-40 or 40-60. I just think the IC needs to give you guys some guidance for that kind of stuff on the margins. Does that sound workable? Or not workable?
For what it's worth, our IT technicians don't do anything with infrastructure, so I'm using that as an example.
understand. Okay,
so
well,
it'd be
that's
very
fine.
easy for me. We
But some people
outsource
there'll be
all of
some
that.
split, but you always have to
But
do
that
that.
was, I'm just trying to represent other LEAs
No,
as
but
well.
what you're bringing up is, and the senator says, it's classic cost accounting. If it's enough to make a difference, to know what the differences are, then you
Yeah.
should account for it.
But if you're not,
If
don't.
not, just put it to where it generally is used.
I'm fine with that.
Great. Thank you.
So I believe that addresses the second part of number 3. What's still left in number 3 that we haven't talked about is isolating the use of operational maintenance. That would be the categorical. Would we want to maybe put a period after funding from other operations and strike the remainder of that sentence and leave that recommendation intact?
I have no idea what you
Let me ask a question. At this point, do we need the second part of that? Do we need to understand what the, if we understand all the costs that are going into owning an operating facility, and it's going to be something that we collect over time, won't that get us to the point of knowing what it takes in dollars for routine maintenance, of capital maintenance, so that the discussion can come back, if that's what we're intending to do, to use that to determine whether more money should come from the funding formula, more money should come from the capital side, CIP and systemics, or whatever it might be. I think once we categorize that we're using it for acquisition, for maintenance, for capital repair, for demolition, renewal, that once we have those numbers in buckets, we can look to see where dollars might be needed additionally. I'm thinking that we're getting too far into the weeds with the way that we had originally
I'm not
worded
clear what
this.
you're talking about taking out.
Okay.
What are you talking about taking out?
What I'm talking
What
about
words?
is leaving number 3 simply as I had suggested, that request that the IAC recommend that the State Board of Education implement standard National Council school facilities definitions to clearly define facility ownership expenses. So,
Okay, if you do that,
yes.
then what to me is the important language is actually number 2. Legislation requires a certain percentage of formula funding or new funding source be dedicated to and spent on routine facilities, maintenance, and operations.
Yes. And it's there already.
That's what I'm going with.
Yes,
The
yes.
first
Great,
part of it is
so
sort
we
of,
can delete the first half of what had
Edited.
been number 3.
As just the
And
language.
keep the
that I
second
just
part
said.
as described.
I would propose that language.
I think that's fine, but they're related to each other because you can't,
They are.
you can't dedicate money.
But
you
2
don't have
covers
definition.
that, but 2 covers that point, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. No, like, if everybody agrees with that, I'm cool with that. Yep,
Okay.
yep.
So any objection to that? Okay. Great question, though. As I read this, I did not hear the way it was being understood by other people, so perfect. Thank you.
Speaking a common language is often what makes it hard to communicate.
Okay. Anything else? So we have a motion and a second. We've had discussion. There's no other discussion. All of those in favor of adopting as we have just revised?
And allowing staff to make non-substantive edits in case we find any more typos.
Thank you.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Your work is done. Thank you.
Here, here, here.
Boy, really great work. Thank you guys so much.
Guys.
I was told to tell you that former senator.
All right, so you've got time to go to the game.
Oh.